Hello, everybody. Welcome to Palestine Bookshelf, and a little later start for our traditional live stream. Just had some things going on today that led me to have to start this discussion a little later. But we are talking about a very fine four-part documentary done on the Nakba, properly pronounced Nikba. But if I lapse and say Nakba, please forgive me. Four parts. Let me just say at the outset, wow. Just a very well done documentary, production values, original music. It reminded me a lot of 1948 Creation and Catastrophes, which is something we've covered on the channel before. And the testimonials, wow, these are people who lived during this time. They're giving us the real color commentary. This is what my mom fed me when we were starving. This is what I remember of this person being killed. This is what I remember when we were living under olive trees, homeless. The fact that this is being bottled and making sure that it is not forgotten and it is not memory hold, and that once you watch it, you then take part of that yourself, and you're carrying the burden of memory for the Palestinians in your own mind and in your own memory. That's really, really helpful. So it's a four-part documentary, and you have um, um, it covering from the 1880s to, I want to say, somewhat the present day, but all the way through 1948. But the implications post 1948 are pretty much the same. So I'm going to try to go through each part. As I do, I will look over in the chat and see if there's any relevant questions I need to answer or resources that need to be shared, and I will do that. But otherwise, I will just keep going. There's a lot to cover. It's four parts, and if you didn't have a chance to see it, so you think each part was about 45 minutes. So you're investing about 3 hours to get through it. So I understand. Normally, with book clubs, with film club, I try to do 45-minute, hour, at the most 2-hour documentaries, because I feel everybody could probably watch a 2-hour documentary sometime during the week. And I understand it's probably a lot harder to do three. And 3 hours as opposed to 2 hours. So I totally understand if you haven't had a chance to watch it, but please do watch it. It will give you one of the best understandings of 1948 that a documentary can give you. Just an outstanding job. It's Al Jazeera, so it always has this high quality, always, that I've come to expect from Al Jazeera. But on this particular issue, just outstanding. I can't recommend it strongly enough. All right. So part one, 1880s. Lord Rothschild visiting. We have rabbis reporting back to the Zionist Congress. The bride is beautiful, but she is already married. These are rabbis reflecting that Palestine is already occupied. So the myth of a land without people for a people without land is already belied by reports from rabbis who were sent by the Zionist World Congress to investigate Palestine as a possibility. And they said, the bride is beautiful, but already married. The land's not empty. There are people already living there. Michael, which documentary? I linked to it in the description of this video. So you'll see there are 4 different parts, and I have each part listed one after the other. Maybe I have it labeled, but it should say part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4. But if it doesn't say the parts, the 4 links are the 4 parts. This documentary answered the missing World War I part for me. Yes. I think that's a great point. So during this time period, we have the Balfour Declaration in 1917. Avi Shlaim, who I'm working through his wonderful book, The Iron Wall. It's a serious book, so it's going to take me a while, but I'm hoping that should be up in the next 2 or 3 weeks, the review of that book. But he points out something which I've continued to harp on as I've learned more about the Balfour Declaration. And I've also got a book back there on the Balfour Declaration, but I'm not probably going to get to it until the end of this year. But it's never questioned on its base. The Balfour Declaration is both illegal and immoral on its face. You cannot promise the land of a country already occupied to someone else that when you don't even own the land. So you're promising the land of that you don't own to someone else who also doesn't own it. So it is illegal, but technically it's immoral. And so the Balfour Declaration, Avi Shlaim and others continue to point out that This is one of the foundations of the Jewish state. Anything founded on injustice cannot last, just naturally speaking. That as a rule of life, something built on lies will eventually collapse. It may look like it would never collapse, but the Roman Empire collapsed at some point, the Persian Empire collapsed at some point. Oh, something seems inevitable until it doesn't. And so the Balfour Declaration, the illegal basis for the Jewish state, was both illegal and immoral. That needs to be confronted more when people bring up the Balfour Declaration and you ask them, um, tell me more about the Balfour Declaration and tell me about the legal force for it. And then tell me about the moral force for it. How is it possible that Britain, who didn't own Palestine, could promise it to the Jews? Doesn't make any sense. I just want you to explain to me any other time that this has happened in which this has been backed by the world. The King Crane Commission comes. I've covered the King Crane Commission report on this channel. You can go back to my regular videos and look for that yourself. But two American men came, one a businessman, I think one a diplomat, and they went through and they interviewed all the locals. And they said, we don't want Zionists here, and there cannot be a Jewish state. They were ignored. Someone who's highlighted in part one is also Herbert Samuel, one of the commissioners of the British Mandate. And sorry, maybe not commissioner is not the right word, but one of the people who was in charge. He was an ardent Zionist. And what he did was he made sure that the Palestinians were put down and the Jews were given what they needed. Now, what you have to understand is you can't simply have a state overnight. You have to have systems in place to have a state. You have to have civil service. You have to have banking, water, electricity, government offices, functionaries. The Jews were allowed to develop this. They were allowed to have their own educational system. They were allowed to develop their own paramilitary, their own militias. They were allowed to buy and sell land. They were allowed to develop banking. Big surprise there. But the idea was the Palestinians were not allowed to develop unless they accepted the Balfour Declaration, which would mean they'd have to accept the fact of their own displacement, an illegal and immoral displacement and gift of their land to somebody else. They were never willing to do this. The British fought for years to manufacture consent of the Palestinians. The Palestinians wouldn't play that game. Now, the Palestinians made some naive and unwise moves in that time period, but it was always under the impression that they believed in the fundamental justice of the rest of the world. They thought, surely the rest of the world isn't going to allow this to happen. And they didn't realize who they were fighting against. A very well-financed, forceful, never say die enemy who happened to also paint themselves as the greatest victims of all time. And so they had no idea who they were going against. We have, was it Stephen Wise? I wrote down Wise here in my notes, but it was a speaker at one of the Zionist congresses in America. And he's got this somewhat squeaky voice, but it could be that that's just the recording we have. But he says, an Arab Palestine is a threat to Britain and a menace to the world. And a Jewish Palestine is, a blessing to Britain and a gift to the world, or something like this again. And I think this was in 1931 that this recording was. And you have to ask yourself, there's probably a dozen different ways that we could talk about that particular statement. Arab Palestine is a threat to Britain and a menace to the world. Let's try to think about that. The Arabs were the allies of the British during the war, during World War I, and they were promised that they would have self-government if they helped the British with this war. As usual, the British lied. Why would Arab Palestine be a threat to Britain? These were their wartime allies. The Jews hadn't fought as a nation. There had been Jewish volunteers who had fought, and then that happened later in World War II. But prior to World War II, the Jews hadn't had any record of fighting as much as the Arabs had for Britain. So why would an Arab Palestine be a threat to Britain and a menace to the world? Because they have to be the baddies. The Arabs have to be the baddies. They have to be the sea of barbarism, and the godly Zionist Europeans will be here to protect us. as referred to by neocons, the unsinkable aircraft carrier. This is a very dated phrase because there's nothing more sinkable than an aircraft carrier with today's missile technology. Aircraft carriers are already outdated. It's just that we haven't entered a war yet where we're going to watch them sunk spectacularly. But everyone has missiles that can sink aircraft carriers. So aircraft carriers are very sinkable. And the idea that Israel is America's unsinkable aircraft carrier, Israel is not inevitable at all. This sort of Thanosization of Israel is just something they keep telling us, that it is inevitable, but it's not true. So in this part one, we have this setup of the Jews being encouraged, the Palestinians being put down, and the Palestinians going hand in hand to the British, to the UN, to everyone saying, hey, do you know this is our land? Do you know we're already living here? Why are you allowing all these people to come? I don't know why they should have special privileges to come here. Why don't you take them in? Let me head over to the chat. By way of deception, you will wage war. Yes. Creating, did you mention this in our previous chat that this is the motto of Mossad? If you did, thank you. They still talk this way about the so-called God of Israel. Yes. Who knows? Remember, Talmudic Judaism is different from Mosaic Quranic Judaism. There's a break. The religion has changed. So Christ, as the Messiah, broke their religion. They had to create a new one, one that's boy, I don't know if we'll ever have time to get into the Talmud, but horrible, horrible book. All right, so part 2, 1936 to 1939. This is one of the crucial things you have to understand of why didn't the Palestinians have an organized resistance in 1948? In part, Rashid Khalidi talks about this in The Iron Cage. Avi Shlaim talks about it in The Iron Wall. Ilan Pape talks about it in The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, that in a sense, the Palestinians had fought their war too early against the wrong enemy. So in 1936 to 1939, you have the Arab Revolt. After, if you think from 1917 to 1936, the Palestinians have been trying to have their voices heard. The British have been trying to manufacture consent. Palestinians have not had it. And then they finally say, that's it. We're going on strike and we're having a revolt. And they're successful. It was a strike for 6 months. And guess who talked the Palestinians out of continuing the strike? The strike was bringing Palestine to its knees. It was bad for the Jews as well. But I think the king of Jordan, or there wasn't Jordan at that time, but there were 2 Arab monarchs who talked the Palestinians into stepping down. They said, we'll work with the British to make sure that justice is done. Of course, no justice is done. And during that time, that 36 to 39 period, the elite, the people who are most patriotic, who most believe in the cause of Palestine, they are fighting the British. And the British are brutal. Murders, executions, home demolitions. And we have testimonies of people in this documentary who witnessed what the British would do. But they were a model for the Haganah. And in fact, a British officer, someone named Ord Wingate is a hallowed, you could say, godfather of Jewish terrorism. We talk about Jewish terrorism. It's really big in the period leading up to 1948, because somehow the Jews were able to put forward the narrative that they were being oppressed by the British. After the British had set them up, they said, oh, we have to throw off our colonial masters, the British. And they start a series of terrorist attacks, killing all sorts of people. I remember I didn't know enough at the time. So when I was standing outside the King David Hotel several times to go on different tours of different parts of Palestine and Israel, it didn't occur to me. The name King David Hotel sounded familiar to me, but at the time I'd only read a couple of books about Palestinian history. I didn't realize, well, I'm standing like where there was a terrorist bombing, one of the big terrorist bombings, where Jews were happy to kill other Jews. There were a number of Jews killed in the King David Hotel bombing. And then there was a truck bombing of the British Officers Club. Who invented truck bombing? Who are the pioneers of truck bombing? Not Muslims, Jews. So Jewish terrorism, and you hear them referred to in the newsreels as Jewish terrorists. That's something you can never say. You can't say Jewish terrorist. That's anti-Semitic. We know that no Jews would ever commit terrorism. That's a crazy idea. Only Muslims do that. And that goes back to that phrase, Arab Palestine is a threat to Britain. Jewish Palestine, that's safe. So we have another commission come after this Arab revolt. The British are thinking, wow, okay, this was pretty bad. We had to put down this revolt brutally. Maybe we should look into this whole Jewish Palestine thing. They send the Peel Commission, and the Peel Commission finds out the same facts that the King Crane Commission did. People do not want unlimited Jewish immigration to Palestine. It's disrupting everything. And because of how the Jews are settling, they're not simply settling like, hey, I'd like to come to Palestine and be your neighbor. It's you need to get out because this is a Jewish state. We're better than you. And we don't want any Arabs here because you're dirty and filthy and you're a threat to Britain and a menace to the world. But what the Peel Commission introduces is a very dangerous idea, which has a direct relationship to President Trump's recent crazy declaration about Gaza. Now, hear me out. What it does is introduces the idea of transfer, population transfer. Now, population transfer is, you can use any number of words. It could be problematic, controversial. It cannot be said to be on its place immoral, on its face. If the populations are willing to be transferred in order for a greater good, it might even be seen to be quite moral or the most moral decision. The precedent we have prior to this time, because the Peel Commission is in the 30s, is the population transfer that happens in the post-Ottoman Turkish resolution, where we have, I think, 500,000 Greeks get moved to the Greek state, and I think 1.5 or 1 million. If anyone in the chat knows and is correcting, but I know that it's not proportional. I think it was 500,000 Greek, mostly Orthodox, and 1 million or 1.5 million Turks, mostly Muslims, were moved into their respective states. It was very orderly. There were bank statements. So if I have $500 in Greece, I'm just making up numbers. Obviously, they didn't use dollars in Greece. But if I had $500 here, that would be put in a ledger. And then when I landed in Turkey, I would be given that same amount of money in my new country. It was very orderly. We can argue, should it have been done? Was it controversial? Was it problematic? Yes, all of those things. But the point was, it was done in an orderly manner. So population transfer has been done by precedent and was done in an orderly, legal way. Whether it should have been done, we can have that discussion. But the idea that it can't be done and that it's immoral on its face, I think, is weak. What the Peel Commission proposes, which the Jews rejoice about, is they offer the idea of transfer because it then creates an idea of an ethnically clean, pure state. Well, we certainly don't want a bunch of Arabs living in the Jewish state. What a horrible idea. But no one seems to have any problems about Jews living in the Arab state. But in any case, the idea of transfer is mentioned in the Peel Commission report. We can have population transfer. And so if that gets us to Trump's Gaza plan, what Trump is proposing, apart from being illegal and immoral, which we already talked about in relation to the Balfour Declaration, you might say it's the Trump Declaration, right? It's illegal, it's immoral. But Trump is doing what Trump does best, which is he's moving the Overton window. If you do not know what the Overton window is, it's this idea of what is capable of being talked about in public. And for better or for worse, sometimes for the better, President Trump has made the unspeakable speakable by mentioning it, where he said, for example, we're going to have a ban on immigration from Muslim countries. And people called it a Muslim ban. It wasn't. But the point was people started asking about immigration because the Overton window got moved. So that's what Trump is doing here. Remember, and I've talked about this, if you're interested, I did a video on a book about Trump by Bob Woodward. I want to say a couple weeks ago now. You can find it on the Stephen Heiner main channel. But Trump doesn't study, he doesn't read, he doesn't discuss, he doesn't welcome alternative points of view. It's just whatever his gut tells him. And apparently there were people in the White House who didn't know what Trump was reading. Netanyahu certainly didn't. If you watch his body language, he had no idea what Trump was going to read. Someone I trust a lot, and you can find, they have a YouTube channel called The Duran, Alexander Mercouris, was saying that he thought this was Trump negotiated in real time, that he was proposing ideas and seen how it landed with the press, with Netanyahu, with everyone. But in Trump style, it's a deal. I'm offering it to you, moving the Overton window, and then I get what I want in exchange. So we saw this happen with the Canada-Mexico tariffs. We're going to tariff Mexico, we're going to tariff Canada. And then all of a sudden, there's some concession about borders, and the tariff goes away. This is how Trump governs, by chaos and executive orders, which this is part of why he's so ineffective. He just creates a bunch of mess. He can't do things legally. If you can't do something legally, it can't last. You get short-term social media wins, photo opportunities. That's what he loves. Trump loves photo opportunities. But long-term action cannot be done except through legislation. That's just how the United States is governed. If you want a dictatorship, that's fine. Create a dictatorship and you can do whatever you want. But the US doesn't run that way. You can't govern by executive order. It just doesn't work that way. But Trump thinks he can executive order Gaza. And for anyone who's been following, Trump clearly hasn't been following the idea that these people who survived 15 months of the IDF murdering them, and they defeated the IDF, armed by US weapons and US money. And you think that you're going to go in and walk these people out of Gaza? I've got a few things to help people who think Trump is going to be successful here think about. I'm going to give you some words, and I want you to think, was America successful here, or was it strategically defeated and humiliated? Afghanistan, Vietnam, Korea, Iraq, Libya. America does not win wars. We may be militarily dangerous and threatening, but we move into areas with little knowledge about what's going to happen. And by the way, we're losing. NATO, NATO is effectively the United States, is losing a war against the Russians because, as usual, the Russians have to be underestimated as, I don't know, the Arabs of Europe. They're dumb. They don't know anything. We'll show them. They're just a gas station run by a dictator. Yeah. And they completely crushed all of your NATO weaponry and all of the crappy training you gave to these Ukrainians, poor people who got massacred and are continuing to get massacred. And so Trump's Gaza plan, like the Peel Commission report, has introduced an idea into people's minds to soften up the ground. Oh, yeah, maybe the Americans could go in. But you look at his ideas, Trump is this one-track person in which he's talking about casinos. Can you imagine this? He's like, yeah, we're going to have some beachfront resorts and casinos. And that's all he ever thinks about. For him, culture is casinos and banks and seaside resorts. The man's shallowness is on display every time he opens his mouth. And so when you look at the Peel Commission, I want you to draw a direct line between the Peel Commission to the Balfour Declaration to what I would call the Trump Declaration, if you want to use something more recent. And that gets us this part is the Palestinians didn't understand how sophisticated the Jews were wiretapping as well. They had paramilitaries who were infiltrating the resistance. You have Jews setting up Islamist nationalist clubs to oppose Palestinians, so it would make it look like the Palestinians were divided. They funded it the same way that the Israelis funded Hamas in the 80s because they wanted to divide the Palestinian leadership. As long as the Palestinian leadership is not unified, you can't have one voice speaking. That's why it took until the 70s for the PLO to be recognized as a single voice of the Palestinian people. During the same time, Ilan Pape points out in part 2 of this documentary, we have the Village Files created, and he talks about this deeply. It's in that back bookshelf, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. The Village Files were files of all of Arab Palestine, in which they said, here's how many people live in this village. Even here's how many fruits are on this tree. Here are the men in the village. Here are the best leaders. Here's how many weapons there are. The intelligence was vast. And this was used for the ethnic cleansing operation that happened in 1948. But it's this crucial time in the 30s in which this is being built up. All right, I'm going to take a pause there. We talked about part 1 and part 2, and there's been a ton in the chat. So I'm going to try to address that. Trump's plan is an admission that Israel has been crushed militarily. They clearly have no idea what to do next. He was effectively running cover and saving Bibi from his own followers. Yes, perhaps, Uncanny. I agree in substance and in large part with your comments, but the whole thing, he gave Trump a golden beeper on top of some, I think, paralyzed um, I'm using the word traumatized, but you wouldn't say that about wood. But an old olive tree, an old growth olive tree that had obviously just been cut down. So, like an old olive tree that had been part of historic Palestine and a golden pager, basically saying, "What, we own you?" And he gave him a real pager too, like a death threat. Like those pagers were used to kill people and maim people, and he gave that to the president. It's a humiliation ritual, and the president obliged him by wearing the blue tie and pulling out the chair for him. The very famous, almost memed video at this point. It's not really a Jewish project; it's a Trojan crusade. Most Zionists in media and government are Roman Catholic. To the chat, not the channel. I wouldn't. I don't think most Zionists in media are Roman Catholic. I think there are some Roman Catholics in the media who are Zionists, but I think the most ardent Zionists are Protestants. You have to remember that the Catholic Church didn't recognize the Zionist project and was opposed to it. It was only in 1993 that Israel was recognized by then John Paul II was not the Pope. He was not an authority. He was a great um, enemy of the Catholic Church. That's a separate conversation, probably for another channel and another time. But 1993, 1948, the Catholic Church didn't recognize that. So the Catholic Church, in fact, was one of the reasons why there were parts of Palestine that were spared, because the Zionists were afraid of going on the wrong side of the Vatican's authority at that time, which there was still quite a lot of authority of the Catholic Church in the 40s and the 50s. And so Nazareth, for example, was particularly protected because it was seen as an enclave of the Vatican. There were a bunch of Arab Christians living there, and they didn't want to upset them. They didn't mind upsetting the Arab Muslims. Who cares about them? But oh well, these people are related to the Catholic Church, so we can't possibly kill them. And what was great, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in part 3, is that these Arab Christians were told, you can go home to your village because you're Christians. And they said, if our Muslim neighbors cannot go home, we don't want to go home either. And just shows you this idea of fundamental notion of justice. They're trying to divide the Palestinians and say, well, the Christians can go back, but not the Muslims. Say, no, we're not going back. We're all together. We're part of the country together. And if we have to be in exile together, we'll be in exile together. They want control of the Suez Canal to ensure the West can control global energy distribution. Well, I mean, they tried that control of the Suez before. I don't know that they could pull that off these days. They could have probably pulled it off in the 50s, but even then the US are the one who slapped that down. That's a different geopolitical discussion. It's a case of plausible deniability, using Judaism as the cover story for military operation on behalf of the West, and especially Rome. This Rome connection is puzzling to me, uncanny. Maybe we can talk about it, develop it some other time. Thanks to Zionist Ben Shapiro, I know of the Overton window. Yes, I mean thanks to lots of people, we know about the Overton window. Utilizing everything you've learned until now, how would you explain the US's true interest in Israel to an uninformed American today? Cruz, let me think about that. As John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt point out in their book, The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy, it is not in the US's strategic interest to be an unwavering supporter of Israel. It causes an eternal problem in the region. So, strategically, for the United States has no interest in Israel. The United States, especially with all the trading it does with all the Gulf states and all the other countries in the region, they would benefit from peace. The United States would. The US weapons industry wouldn't benefit from peace. They need to sell weapons to everybody, and they can only sell weapons if there's a threat of war. What Israel needs is a patron. They used to have Britain as a patron, and now they have the US as a patron when Britain left the world stage. So I would reverse this and say the Israeli true interest is to have the US there unstinting forever as their supporter. There is no US interest in Israel. Now, one of the reasons that the US is engaged in that area is because of this crazy so-called Christian Zionism. But Christian Zionism is an oxymoron in the same way that Judeo-Christian doesn't mean anything. Judeo-Christian, if you look back at the term, it was originally a Jew who converted to Christianity. So it was used as an adjective. That person is a Judeo-Christian. He used to be a Jew. He's now a Christian. It then got turned into this quote unquote Judeo-Christian value. There's no such thing as Judeo-Christian values. There's no such thing. It's a completely made up idea. So same thing like Christian Zionism. Well, if if you're a Christian, you believe that Jesus is the Messiah. We're not waiting for the Messiah like the Talmudic Jews are. So Christian Zionism is a bit of an oxymoron, but it drives so much that there are people who come over, Protestants, American Protestants, who go to Israel and plant olive trees and do farming during the summer as like a summer project to help to help Israel bloom. Because in their mind, the Messiah can only come if Israel is entirely under the control of the Jews. But how could the Messiah come? The Messiah has already come. The only person who can come now is Antichrist prior to the second coming of Christ. But the short answer, Cruz, the U.S. has no true interest in Israel. It is entirely manipulated by the Israel lobby. It is harmful. It has been and continues to be harmful to U.S. strategic interests in the area and to world peace for us to be in the position we are with Israel. If we withdrew the support and Israel was forced to live in peace with their neighbors, it would be better for everybody. But we can't do that because Israel wants not only control of what they have, but they want everything else too. They need greater Israel, and they can only have greater Israel if they have our support for their war crimes and their genocides. Money talks to Trump. That's all he cares about. And having photo opportunities with Kim Jong-un. If you see that in the Woodward book, he just keeps bragging about all these photos he took with Kim Jong-un, but he didn't accomplish anything. He loves photo opportunities. 9/11 truth was used for too. All of them drew the audience to the right wing. Hologram planes encourages magical thinking, cult grooming. That's interesting, Uncanny. Talk about that probably more on the Steven Heiner channel, talking about 9/11. Did you hear he got a golden pager from Netanyahu? Yes, Craney and I talked about that. Ancient aliens straight out of Hitler's real cult. So is Odinism or neo-paganism. Creating chaos is what the U.S. is good at. Yes, that is true. The goal was never to win. It's to prevent industrial power from developing. Iran and Russia is about a monopoly over weapons manufacturing. Yes, and about a monopoly over who controls what in the world. Using religious extremists to destabilize secular governments is Western foreign policy 101. That's what MAGA is. Syria falls, the Golan Heights, new annexed area is called Trump Heights. I'd heard this. I wasn't sure if it was satirical, but I wouldn't be that surprised if it was true. It's not hard to slip a pager in a Zionist pocket either. Like they say, they open a Pandora's box. I don't remember who said this. Who said this? A military observer. Oh, Scott Ritter. So Scott Ritter pointed out this was a one-time thing. Once you've used the technology and everyone knows about it, you can't use something like that again. So they played cards that Israel been working on this pager thing for years, 5-10 years. They played that card in a really desperate hour for themselves. They needed a win and they got one. And then they exploded the walkie-talkies the next day. But these are one-time use weapons. And as you say, it can be used against them. There are true believers as Jews, but 80% of American Jews don't support Zionism. Over a third of the Senate is Catholic, 7/9 members of the Supreme Court. It's the hidden hand. 80% of American Jews don't support Zionism. I don't accept that, Uncanny. When you say don't support Zionism, I effectively read that as supporting the state of Israel. And I do not see Jews in large-scale protests protesting Israel. So if they may say, I don't support Zionism, but that means I'm not going to get in the street and march for Zionism. But they're not opposed to it. So when you say don't support, it just means maybe not enthusiastic about, but they're not going to oppose the Zionist project, which is Israel today. So that 80% number, I think, is wrong. I know that most of Jerusalem is under Vatican domain. Kenny, we might be going into sort of Vatican Jesuit conspiracy theory, this is the wrong channel for that. You might guess, given the decorations around here. I'm grateful that most people don't understand the Suez Connection helps to isolate Zionism as a brutal ideology. Money, there's an active monetary lobby in Congress to hold. Yeah, that's through AIPAC, of course. They have set a precedent. Now anyone can drop off an Amazon's delivery to any Zionist. It's true, uncanny, but I could never encourage terrorism um, as a way to fix terrorism. Principle of the double effect there. You cannot do an evil such that a good can result. That's basic Christian moral theology. 2022 American Jews, when Zionism defined as the belief in privileging Jewish rights over non-Jewish rights in Israel. 69% of American Jews said that they were probably or definitely not Zionist. Yeah, again, people can say what they want in a poll, but I do not see people marching in the street against the policies of Israel. So this is happening. Privileged Jewish rights over not, that is happening. That's not a theory. That is happening. And it's not being protested by American Jews. So I don't accept that, whatever anyone wants to say in a poll, that's fine. But it's actions. I don't believe what people say. I believe what they do. I believe people's actions. And no one is out in the street protesting Israel without getting arrested. If you're a college student in Columbia University, you get arrested. All right, moving on to part 3. So Moshe Sherratt is quoted as saying the Jewish state is not going to be a racial project. It's not going to be a religious project. And of course, that's exactly what the Jewish state is in 1947. And in 1937, this is pointed out in a documentary, Haj Amin al-Husseini had been out of Palestine. He'd been driven out during the time of the Arab Revolt, and he had not really been in touch with what was going on the ground. And as we said, the elite, the flower of Palestinian nationalism, was crushed during 1936 to 1939, fighting the British. So they weren't really on hand in 1948 to fight the Jews, who were very well organized, very well armed. And it points out they had some of the testimonials from some of the people who were there. They said we had 1 rifle and 4 bullets. And so, yes, they had, but it was almost like to repel one invader, one intruder, not a well-organized battalion or even a squad attacking you with 1 machine gun. That would be enough to make the whole village flee. And as we pointed out in other videos, in January 1948, this is 4 months before the Jewish state is declared on May the 15th, 1948, there were attacks on Palestinian villages. And what they were doing is they were preparing for what they could do after May of 1948. But 400,000 Palestinians had been evicted out of the what is so-called mandated Jewish state by the 1947 UN partition resolution. Ben Gurion's diary entries note the importance of destroying homes, expelling villagers. Then we also have the most moral army in the world on video thieving and looting Haifa and Jaffa. We see them carting rugs from Palestinian homes. Remember, this is the most moral army in the world, and they're stealing from the Palestinians. Pointing out that there are no borders to this day. There are no declared borders of the state of Israel. Every other country in the UN has declared borders. Israel has never declared their borders because they want it all. We have Golda Meir. We have her on video lying. They're better armed than us. They outnumber us, when it was actually the opposite. Remember, with Israelis, with Zionists, every accusation is a confession. So it's always reversed. So when they say they outnumber us, they outgun us, what they really mean is we outnumber them, we outgun them. But you need to give us a lot of money. And she got that money, and she bought a bunch of Czech weapons with it. If you want to know more, I've done a review on the Stephen Heider main channel, which I'll eventually do here on Palestine Bookshelf as well, on Avi Shleim and Eugene Rogan's edited War for Palestine, in which they talk about, well, what was the condition of the Iraqi army, the Arab Legion, the Syrian army, the Lebanese army, the Egyptian army, what actually happened after May of 1948, and was it this narrative of this huge Arab army that was going to throw us, 6 Arab armies invaded, and they were going to throw us into the ocean, and little old Israel fought back. That isn't actually the narrative. You have to look a little closer. This documentary in part 3 doesn't go too deeply into it, but I would encourage you, if you want to go deeper with it, consider the War for Palestine. At the end of part 1 of the film, Ben Gurion asked the Palestine High Commissioner to send Palestinians to Jordan. Yeah, that's been an argument. I've even heard that. I remember Rashid Khalidi in a video being asked this in a book talk about the Iron Cage. And they said there is a Palestinian state. It's called Jordan. And that's where they should go. And we have this argument. And again, Trump articulated another way that that's where they need to go. And it's really an existential problem for both Egypt and Jordan. If that were to even happen, let's play it out intellectually, okay? That if they were to send Palestinians into those places and the Palestinians were accepted to go, they would destabilize, they would topple both of those governments. And so they would then create a larger problem, which of course Israel would love because then they could invade everybody and take over everybody. But the Jordanian king does not want more Palestinians. The Palestinians already comprise a huge number of Jordanian citizens. And the pressure in Egypt, although they don't have a large Palestinian population, is totally against Sisi's repression of the Palestinians. So even if Palestinians were to enter, they would destabilize both of those countries and their governments. I propose an Aryan Semitic alliance to create a superior Caucasian race. Benjamin Disraeli. It's called Accusations in a Mirror, and it's a hate speech incitement tactic used in genocide, the basis of the anti-Semitism laws they themselves wrote. All right, moving on to part 4 and the last part. Thank you. This is actually one of our longer film club discussions, so thank you for staying on with us. And it seems that we have a fairly lively chat. I'm going to let that continue to go on. Part 4, really interesting, beautiful story that I saw. Beautiful is the word I'm thinking of, beautiful insofar as the mother's love. That he said, we didn't have any food to eat. My mom took hay, mixed it with oil and onion so that we would have something to eat. And he sharing that, and that's how we survived. That's a very poignant, very visceral idea of what these people suffered. And to have an eyewitness report that, have it recorded, shared, and now it's shared with me, it's shared with you. I think it's really positive to have that. We have in part 4, the murder of Count Volker Bernadotte by the Stern Gang, led by Yitzhak Shamir, future prime minister of Israel. As we know, part of, there's a humiliation ritual, but here it's a sort of a murder ritual. If you want to be an important leader in Israeli government, you need to murder and genocide and kill people. And that's how you get the moral legitimacy. You had someone like Ariel Sharon, a war criminal, Moshe Dayan, Yitzhak Shamir, all these people, war criminals. They then, that qualifies you to be in charge of the Israeli government. We have Moshe Sherratt in part 4 being quoted, "We will be loyal to the UN, but the UN must be loyal to Israel." When has Israel ever been loyal to the UN? They just recently withdrew from the Human Rights Council, which again, the embarrassment was that they were allowed to resign. They should have been kicked out a long time ago, which then underlines the UN as a useless body, and the UN Human Rights Council doesn't mean anything. If Israel was allowed to resign from the Human Rights Council, it means the UN Human Rights Council doesn't mean anything. They should have been expelled. Israel getting expelled, this is something that is historically resonant for Israelis. Israel is a peace-loving state. This is a quote from the UN on the admission. Can you think of a more ironic statement? On their admission to the UN, Israel is a peace-loving state. Israel was founded by murder and genocide. It continues to murder and genocide to this day. It's never stopped. A really wonderful quote, again, from Avi Shleim. Israel is always ready to engage in war, and it's always reluctant to engage in peace. Once the ethnic cleansing of the peoples begins, then you can have an ethnic cleansing of memory and of maps. So they have to be erased. The villages have to be erased. The name has to be erased. You have Golda Meir saying there was no such thing as a Palestinian, even though she had a Palestinian identity card. And any reports that the IDF has that relate to embarrassing the Israeli state or the reputation, such as it is called, of the Israeli state is suppressed. So we have an Israeli historian, really wonderful. He's in all 4 parts, but in part 4, he said he marked in his journal he wanted a particular piece relating to refugees. And they said, in 10 years, we can give you this information. He waits 10 years. He goes and says, yeah, it's been 10 years. So like, okay, we'll give it to you in another 10 years. Again, national security reasons. We can't give you this information because it would expose us for the genociding murderers that we are. So we can't let you have that information. Something that's interesting that was made in part 4 as well is the idea that the Palestinians are unaware of the extent to how well the Jews prepared for 1948 and how well they are still managing things. So they have some idea, but they really haven't taken the time to study it. And I think that's an interesting point. In a sense, as ignorant as the Jews are of the Palestinians and the Nakba and the real story, a lot of Palestinians are still ignorant about how the Jews were able to get all the support ready for the Jewish state to come into existence. They put in a lot of hard work, including, as I say, murder, wiretapping, infiltration, creating fake opposition. But they did all the other stuff too in order to create a state. And what we have now, and what the documentary ends with, more Arab betrayal. And this is something that has started to have more currency in my mind. If the Arabs wanted to end this, they could tomorrow by putting a major oil embargo on the entire world and saying, we're not selling anymore. We don't need any oil to function. Saudi Arabia has its own oil supply. They don't need to worry about access to oil. But all the Gulf countries could say, we're not selling any more oil until this problem with Palestine is resolved. And it would end tomorrow. This would include the Turks. The Israelis can't survive without Turkish oil. So all of these Muslim states or these Arab states, they could end this tomorrow, but they haven't. So there is a major betrayal of the Palestinians by the Arab states to this day. So that's one. Second, the idea of there being more land and fewer Arabs. That's part of the Greater Israel Project. And as someone alluded to in the chat, as soon as Syria's government falls, there's more land being occupied there. And finally, the idea of there being a slow Nakba to the present day. What happened in 1948 was a flash movement, but what we have today in the settlements in the West Bank, what we saw in Gaza for 15 months, is a slower Nakba in slow motion. Gaza was not slow by any means. That was a live streamed Nakba, but they triumphed. And I'm in awe of those Palestinian people, particularly the ones who are marching back to their homes in the north. How inspiring is that photo? How inspiring are those people? Final thoughts on part 4. What is built on injustice must be destroyed. What is built on injustice must be destroyed. And nothing unjust can last, even in the natural order, certainly in the supernatural order, but not in the natural order. All right, going back to chat. Leo, great point. He was arguing for the right of refugee return, and that is something that's also mentioned in part 4, and always needs to be brought up. Without a serious discussion of the right of refugee return, there is no possible solution. There is no Palestinian state. If they manage to create a deal with a Palestinian state without the right of refugee return, it's a major poison pill, and that will lead to terrorist actions from Palestinians who don't accept that as an idea. And it would mean that all of the resistance for all these years was in vain. Because the idea was, we don't accept this. We do not accept being ethnically cleansed from our own land. The refugees must have a right to return. And if that poisons your idea of a Jewish state, sorry, you could have done anything else other than what you did. But what you did was historically documented in front of everybody, and it has to change. And if the Israeli state was able to extort all this money from Germany in reparations for things that they alleged, things that were much more clearly documented, could certainly be levied on Israel. And they would have to pay up in enormous sums plus interest, something that they're not used to paying. So it's inconceivable that could happen. That's why it can't be allowed to happen. But it could happen. The question is how? How can it happen? And it's clear the Arab states have to cooperate. They will either cooperate with the Zionists against their own people, or they will cooperate with the Palestinians in defense of their people. But the Arabs have to be part of this. They have been complicit in the genocide for many years, and they continue to be to this present day. All Arab leaders are subservient to the U.S., otherwise they'd be removed or toppled. Rodwan, great point, but the leaders are not correspondent to the populations. So the question is, will there be a correspondence between the population and the leadership? If what we have to go by, U.S. foreign policy, that can't be allowed to happen. Remember, that's why we overthrew Iran's democratically elected government in 1953. we couldn't allow the Iranians to be in charge of their own oil. What a crazy idea. The Iranian oil is for us and for the British. Why would the Iranians have some crazy idea that they could keep some of their own oil revenues? Any country that has crazy ideas about taking care of their own people and not taking care of Wall Street, they need to be removed. And they need to be re-educated that the point of their country is to serve us, not to serve their own people. So you're right, but Arab leaders don't only ever have to be controlled by the US. And that's something that those populations have to take care of. The crimes that will be exposed precisely because they couldn't secure Gaza will be shared with the world and will horrify them. Uncanny. How horrified is the world? I don't know. It's a cruel world. Balfour Declaration was unjust by the UK and Zionist movement. They never respected the inhabitants of the land by the Ottoman land rules on which it was stated. Yes, we talked about this as part of part 1 of the documentary. Yoav Gallant admitted the Hannibal Directive did take place. Yeah, well, to be clear, Uncanny, what he said was it took place, it was given in some areas and in other places it wasn't. And he said it was bad that there wasn't a clear directive. But yes, you're right. But we didn't need Yoav Gallant to admit this. It was admitted by pilots who flew that day back early on. The Gray Zone documented this a year ago. So Gallant simply confirmed this, but this isn't new information. Sisi, Erdogan, Assad, Saudi, Jordan, Kuwaiti, UAE, Bahrain, royals are all tied to Wahhabi. Yeah, as I say, Uncanny, there's a question of who's ruling versus what the populations believe. And I don't think the populations of most of those countries accept the narrative. So the question is, can those installed leaders, can those supported leaders continue on indefinitely? And with US aid being defunded and the chaos that Trump is putting together, sometimes that chaos can work for good. It's causing chaos in Ukraine right now because all of their press was funded and that's being cut off. The Ukrainian tap is tapped out. That's an entirely different discussion. I don't really want to get into it here. This is Palestine Bookshelf. I want to keep the focus on the Palestinians. But the idea is there is a tie to leaders in the area. And as long as those leaders are supported, there will not be change. All of you have noted that in the chat, and I totally align myself with your comments. All right. Coming up on almost an hour discussion, lively chat, lots of discussion, lots of facts being shared, lots of alternative points of view. I appreciate everything that's being shared. I don't always agree with everything that's in the chat, but I agree being educated about different concepts and different ideas. And if I have time and inclination, I will definitely look into them more. And for those who else might be curious, please feel free to take a look at the live chat as well as any chats that you might add, anything that you might add in the chat after. If you're watching this in replay, please consider adding your own comments and resources so that we can all learn together. A reminder that this channel primarily supports the Palestine Children's Relief Fund. So any sort of profits after we pay the video editors and the other people who help create the channel, all those profits go to the Palestine Children's Relief Fund. That's the entire point of Palestine Bookshelf. So it's not a money-making venture for me. In fact, it's been a money-losing venture for months and months as we've tried to get the channel up to getting monetized. And you all are a part of that, and I appreciate that. But once the channel does get monetized and we are making some money, that money is going to go there. If you don't know about the Palestine Children's Relief Fund, I'll put a link to it, hopefully in the description after the stream ends. But you can go find them, PCRF, Google them, and they help give medical care to Palestinian children who could not otherwise get it. So sometimes that means flying them out of the country, getting a special visa, allowing them to repatriate to Palestine once the operation is done. It's one of those things that the Israelis are not able to lock these kids out after they get life-saving surgery. It's too embarrassing for them. So PCRF, and they were in Gaza the entire time during the siege, doing great work. So can't say enough about them. Please consider supporting them. Also, please consider reporting the Hin Rajab Foundation. They are pursuing legal cases against these genocidal IDF maniacs, particularly in their home countries of dual nationality. So they're prosecuting Belgian Israelis who have Belgian nationality because you don't need permission to prosecute a Belgian for war crimes. And so these people are having to run and hide. They may renounce their nationality, but that doesn't change the criminality of the act. If you had Belgian nationality at the time that you committed a crime, You can run off to Israel, and Israel may refuse to extradite. You remember Israel refuses to extradite a number of child molesters that live in Israel, and that person can escape. But that means they can't travel to Europe anymore and go on vacation after committing some genocide. So the Hin Rajab Foundation also needs your help. Great work, named after a wonderful and inspiring young girl who was murdered by the IDF. So those are a couple foundations that I've researched. They are AAA checked in terms of not being full of corruption and putting as much money towards the Palestinians as possible. And I researched that before putting myself behind a charity for the channel, because I can't support every possible cause. But I want to encourage you to look at the PCRF and the Hin Rajab Foundation. All right. I'll give a couple more minutes. If there are any other questions, any other thoughts, as I said, today's discussion, although it ranged into different areas, was primarily about Al Jazeera's 4-part documentary on the Nakba, which was, I think, written and directed by a Palestinian. And she did a fantastic job. Lovely lady doing all of these really important interviews. I'm so grateful to her. And you should be grateful to her as well for all the work that she did. Desert, Israel snuck some soldiers out of Brazil not too long ago. Yeah, so Desert, what's interesting there is the legal theory about the legal onus on a third country. So in this case, the Israelis that were in Brazil were not Brazilian nationals. So there's pressure that's being put on Brazil. Hey, these people are in your territory. You have jurisdiction over them. You need to stop them so that we can prosecute them. Brazil is going to say, we don't have jurisdiction over these. These people are just tourists. They're just passing through. We're not going to create a situation with the Israeli government. So however brave these countries be, like, oh, we have to support the Palestinians, are they going to get into a legal war with the Israelis? That's where the rubber hits the road, right? And that's where the legal case is more difficult. Whereas if I'm a Belgian national, I can be prosecuted in Belgium today. There's not any legal case to make. Like, can we prosecute Belgians in Belgium? Yes. So the Brazilian case was murkier legally. You have to ask, we don't have precedent in international law for intercepting suspects of a genocide in a third country of which they're not a citizen. And the Hin Rajab Foundation acknowledges that this is a more difficult case to make, whereas they're proceeding with cases against British, Belgians, Germans, anyone who has Israeli nationality that is also we have documentation. And they were stupid enough to post themselves without masks on social media, murdering killed children, wearing women's lingerie, bombing people's homes, and they got caught. Classic FAFO moment for the IDF. And they didn't realize there's all of us watching social media now. And last week's film club, in which we looked at the Al Jazeera investigation series documenting war crimes in Gaza, we have all of their faces and all of their names. Congratulations, you played yourself. Sanction Israel for war crimes. Thank you, Soprano. That is important. Google Trump Heights, Stephen. You'll see a big billboard on the interwebs. Do I want to see Trump Heights? I think this is one of those horrible things. I told people that I'm going to Egypt this summer, but the big long-term project is to go to Damascus and to go to Tehran. These are the places I'm most interested in going. And that's just hard to do these days. But my hope is in the next 5 years, I'll be able to go to both of those places. And then obviously St. Petersburg and Moscow. That's a little easier to get to than Tehran or Damascus, but those are not places that are easy to get to right now. So I'm hoping in 3, 4, 5 years, I'll be able to go. But definitely I'm going to Egypt this summer. Be very interesting to talk to the people at that time, get a sense of how the Egyptians feel about Palestinians, and just talk to them about their country and what's been going on with CC, etc. I won't be able to stream about that. I'm going to do a stream when I'm in Cairo with you all. I don't know what I'll be able to talk about because I feel that their internet is monitored, but I will probably do one after I leave Egypt as well. But I have to do a bit more research as I want to be respectful and obey the laws of a country. If I'm in Egypt, I need to follow their laws. And so if you're not allowed to talk about certain things, I don't want to get myself into trouble. Cairo would be great to see. Yeah, I thought that I really enjoyed being able to talk to all of you in Beirut this summer after I visited Shatila and was able to give you my like fresh and raw impressions. And I'm able to look back at that video and see, well, what was I thinking? What was I feeling? I was able to talk about it hours after I had done that. So I'm hoping to do that with Cairo as well. But as I say, I don't know what I'm allowed to talk about in Egypt. So I need to do some research and find out before I do. You have more immunity as foreign national. I don't want to test that uncanny. I want to just be respectful of a country's laws and not worry about it. I'll be in China. I'm going to be in China later this summer as well. I have to be even more careful about what I say there. So it'll be good practice to practice in Egypt first. Randy Credico posted a mobile free Palestinian billboard in New York City. That was cool to see. Desert, if you could put a link to it in the comments, I think everyone else would like to see it as well. All right. We're at an hour. Thank you so much for a very lively live stream today. Great questions, great information. And as I say, if you get nothing else from today's live stream, please take the time to watch this 4-part documentary. You will get as close, I don't want to say as close to what I've done because I haven't done anything. I've just been reading books, but I've had to earn all the knowledge that's are in these 4 documentaries. I've had to earn by a lot of reading. You can earn it by just a few hours of watching. And when I say earn it, I mean, you obviously will always get more from reading, but you're going to get caught up in such a rich and dynamic way. And again, wonderful production values, beautiful music, incredible testimonials. I'm sure some of the people in that documentary have already passed away. So much bravery, so much inspiration. Thank you all for coming. Please consider the charities that I talked about. And please, as you go back through other Palestine Bookshelf reviews, consider sharing them on socials, liking them. The more those videos get liked, shared, and viewed, the faster this channel can get monetized. And as the faster the channel gets monetized, the more money can go to the PCRF, which is one of the stated aims of this channel, apart from educating people about Palestine. Al-Jazeera is a great resource. That's true. Sharif Kudus at Dropsite News can help with info about Egypt. I was going to write that down, Eva, but I realized like it's here on the live stream. So when I come back and I watch the live stream for editing later, I'll make sure to write this down, but I'm just going to make a note. Eva about Egypt at just about the 1 hour and 2 minute mark. All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your weekend, and we'll see you next week for another film club discussion. Watch the community tab for the announcement about that. Thanks for stopping by.